Welcome and thank you for joining this Pioneer Institute webinar, Systemic Failure in IDEA Funding for Private School Students. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Education Research and Policy at Pioneer. I hope you and your families are safe and sound. We're so pleased to be joined today by Jason Bedrick, Director of Policy for EdChoice, Tom Olson and Steve Perla, Principal Partners of ADAC, Nancy Kriegel, Executive Director of Yad Chesed, and Kate McConnell, Director of Inclusion Education for the Archdiocese of Chicago. Please note that the audience will be muted for this program. If you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We will review them at the end of the program. The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. President George Washington famously wrote to the Toro Synagogue congregation of Newport, Rhode Island in August 1790. That is, for the founding generation, religious liberty was considered the first liberty, and nowhere was their pluralistic vision of religion clearer than how early state constitutions addressed the rights of parents to order the education of their children. This is why our topic today is so fundamental. The Federal Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA, of 1990 reauthorized previous national special education legislation. It ensures students with a disability are provided with free, appropriate public education tailored to their individual needs. This federal civil rights program for special needs students has an approximately $14 billion annual budget, which funds grants to states and local school districts. According to federal law, special education students in religious schools are supposed to be able to access these IDEA funds. That's why in 2017, Pioneer worked with representatives of the Massachusetts Catholic and Jewish day schools who are here with us today to publish the research paper, No IDEA, How Massachusetts Blocks Federal Special Education Funding for Private and Religious School Students. As the title indicates, both the Obama and Trump administrations cited the Massachusetts Department of Education going back 5 to 10 years for blocking IDEA funds from reaching special needs students in the Bay State's religiously affiliated schools. The total figure the US Department of Education said Massachusetts owed these religious school students range from $150 million to $300 million. Our panelists today will explain the Massachusetts situation in more detail. But little did we know in 2017 that Massachusetts was really only the tip of the iceberg. That's why we just released a new report, Bad IDEA, How States Block Federal Special Education Funding to Private and Religious School Students. This report makes clear that state and local public education entities across the country are also systematically obstructing the flow of IDEA funds to religiously affiliated students. As our panelists will discuss, this is part of a larger phenomenon across state and local public education, whereby discriminating against special needs students in faith-based schools seems to be a common practice. We've published these papers to ensure the public system is accountable for upholding the law. Finally, it's worth noting that as a free and enlightened people, we should be ever wary of public officials who either sanction only a rigidly secular view of K-12 education or attempt to impede religious parents educating their children according to what the founders called the dictates of their conscience. To tell us more about the larger national landscape regarding religious liberty and schooling in K-12 education, I'm pleased to introduce to you Jason Bedrick of EdChoice.
Jamie, thank you so much for having me. I'd like to thank the Pioneer Institute for hosting this excellent event about a very, very important topic. Jamie opened with something that I wanted to open with as well, which is the famous letter from George Washington to the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. So as Jamie mentioned, on August 17th, 1790, President George Washington paid a visit to Newport, Rhode Island, along with several other dignitaries, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Shortly after his arrival, he was greeted by a delegation from the Toro Synagogue in Newport, which presented him with a letter welcoming the president, expressing their gratitude and esteem for him, and praying for his well-being and success. A day later, Washington sent a reply in which he reflected on the character of their new nation. He wrote in part, quote, "The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." In other words, unlike in Europe, where religious minorities were at best second-class citizens who were merely tolerated by the majority, in America, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion meant something much more, that all citizens were equal under the law as they are in the eyes of their creator. And these were no empty words for Washington. 3 years earlier, as he presided over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Washington received a letter from a local Jewish community leader named Jonas Phillips, who protested the policy that all public office holders in Pennsylvania were required to affirm that the New Testament was given by divine inspiration. As Phillips noted, such an oath is absolutely against the religious principle of a Jew, and it is against his conscience to take any such oath. Phillips therefore implored that the convention create a country in which, quote, "all religious societies are on equal footing." Fortunately for us, the convention did indeed produce a constitution that prohibited any religious test for public office, meaning that all citizens, no matter their faith, were eligible to serve in even the highest offices in the land, at least eventually. America did not always live up to Washington's vision, of course. Several years after the Constitutional Convention, Jonas Phillips himself was called upon to serve as a witness in a court case that was being held on a Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. Phillips refused, arguing, as Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik has summarized, that true equality demanded he be allowed to obey the dictates of his conscience, the general law notwithstanding. The court, however, did not see things the same way, and they fined him 10 pounds. This case, Stansbury versus Marks, has been called by Stanford law professor Judge Michael McConnell, quote, "the first recorded case raising free exercise issues following the adoption of the First Amendment." So we've come a long way since then toward achieving Washington's vision, though not without great struggle. In one famous episode, more than a century later, America's commitment to religious freedom and equal treatment was sorely tested when nativists in Oregon attempted to outlaw private schools. Concerned about the rising levels of immigration, particularly Catholic immigrants bringing with them Romanism and rebellion, nativists sought to use America's public schools as a tool to Americanize, which is to say Protestantize, the children of recent immigrants. In those days, public schools were actually de facto non-denominational Protestant schools, which led children in Protestant prayer and taught them the Protestant Bible. Any Episcopalian, Congregationalist, or Baptist would feel comfortable sending their children to such schools, but for obvious reasons, Catholics did not, which is why they built their own system of Catholic schools. Equal treatment would have entailed providing public funding for the Catholic schools and the schools of other religious minorities on par with the public support for the Protestant schools. However, because the nativists had succeeded in passing the odious Blaine amendments prohibiting public funds from flowing to so-called sectarian schools, that option was not on the table. Contrary to Washington's vision, the most religious minorities in America at that time could aspire to with regards to their children's education was mere tolerance. But even that was a bridge too far for some people. The notorious Ku Klux Klan and other nativist groups worked to pass an initiative banning private education in Oregon. The goal was obvious: the elimination of Catholic schooling. Catholic schools filed suit, claiming their rights under the First and 14th Amendments were being infringed. In 1925, the case, Pierce v. the Society of Sisters, came before the US Supreme Court. Religious minorities held their breath. Would the court protect the right of religious minorities to educate their children according to the dictates of their conscience? Was America truly a nation that gave to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance? Fortunately for us, the court answered unanimously in the affirmative, declaring, quote, "the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations, end quote. The decision was a tremendous victory for religious liberty and religious minorities, but much work remained. The Supreme Court declared that religious minorities had the right to educate the children according to the dictates of their conscience. They were, at least, to be tolerated, but the fight for equal treatment continued. Nearly a century later, the Supreme Court considered yet another case, Trinity Lutheran v. Comer, concerning religious liberty and equal protection. The state of Missouri had enacted a program that would provide grants to schools and other organizations to resurface their playgrounds with recycled tires. The Trinity Lutheran Church of Columbia in Missouri, which operated a preschool, applied for a grant but was denied. They met all of the criteria necessary to receive a grant, except for one. They were a religious organization. The Missouri Constitution's Blaine Amendment declared that, quote, no money shall ever be taken from the public treasury directly or indirectly in aid of any church, section, or denomination of religion. The church sued, arguing that their rights under the First and 14th Amendments were being infringed. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court agreed, declaring that, quote, the exclusion of Trinity Lutheran from a public benefit for which it is otherwise qualified solely because it is a church is odious to our Constitution and cannot stand. There was, however, a footnote, the infamous footnote 3, which supposedly limited the case to, quote, express discrimination based on religious liberty with respect to playground resurfacing. The court was not, the footnote declared, addressing religious uses of funding or other forms of discrimination. In other words, the court was not addressing whether states' Blaine amendments could continue to be used to deny religious schools access to school vouchers and other forms of school choice. That case would come just a few years later. Last year, in the landmark Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue decision, a narrower 5-4 majority of the court essentially neutered the Blaine amendments, declaring, quote, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. In many ways, we are now closer to Washington's vision than ever, but work still remains. There are still those who believe that religious liberty means freedom from religion rather than freedom of religion. There are still those who believe that religious neutrality means de facto secularism, rather than that the government should neither favor nor disfavor any one religion or non-religion, and not favor religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. As the debate over the Espinoza case makes clear, there are competing understandings of what the constitutional promise of religious liberty requires. One side holds that what the Constitution prohibits is merely discrimination on the basis of religious status, but that the state may still discriminate on the basis of religious activity. The other side finds any such distinction to be without a difference. As Justice Gorsuch asks in the Trinity Lutheran case in a concurrence that dissented only with respect to that footnote 3, Justice Gorsuch asked, does a religious man say grace before dinner, or does a man begin his meal in a religious manner? Is it a religious group that built the playground, or did a group build the playground so that it might be used to advance a religious mission? Again, these are a distinction without a difference. Or are they? The court sidestepped this question in Espinoza, but will likely soon have to address it head on in the town tuitioning cases in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont that are quickly wending their way toward the Supreme Court. Likewise, there is much work to be done to ensure that religious schools receive their equitable share of IDEA funds for students with special needs. And to address that issue, I now invite Nancy Kriegel and Steve Perla to join for their remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And, we very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today about our experience, particularly in Massachusetts, relative to IDEA. And if we go to the next slide, please. So the first thing we'd like to give you is a little bit of a context. And the context is this, that in Massachusetts, and by the way, this law was relatively new. It was in 2000, we had lobbied for this new law, that in our state, those students that attended non-public schools would in fact have an individual right to service Unfortunately, as you heard some of the previous presenters, because of the anti-aid provision in our state constitution, the only way in which those students could access services is if they went to a public school site during the day in which they were at school, which of course, as you can well imagine, is a real barrier for many of those students. Next slide, please. So if you're a non-public school student, up until recently, and you had a learning challenge and were diagnosed with some sort of disability or combination of disabilities, you really only had three choices. One, you could attend a non-public school. And if you did, as I just mentioned, you would have to leave your private school and go to the nearby public school for service. I want you just to pause and think about that for a moment. Here you have a student who in fact has some learning challenges, and you're asking that student to in fact leave their place where they're comfortable as a safe environment, and you're now asking them to go to an entirely different environment to be provided some service. And by the way, also think about those families that it would be just completely impractical for them to get their son or daughter from one school to the next during the middle of a school day. The second was really to attend a non-public school and just forego the services. How absurd is that? If students need services, it is critical for their own educational success that they have access to these services. So even though some parents opted for this, as an educator all my life, this is something that really concerns me, that we would put families in this position and have to make that sort of choice. Also, the third really is what we heard the previous speakers really address in some ways, religious liberty, is this idea that if you're a parent and you want to have your student be able to access services, then in some cases, you just can't opt for the religious school or the private school. And from our perspective, that really is a violation of that student and that family's religious liberty. Next slide, please. So having known the situation with the state of Massachusetts, we really tried to address, if you will, that particular circumstance. We, in fact, really tried to work with the State Department of Education to try to get them to kind of revisit their regulations and how, in fact, special ed was being provided to our private schools. And what we found was that in the state, it was going to be very difficult to get them to shift away from their only real focus in terms of the public sector and really try to work with us, at least initially. So we began to explore what IDA offered. Now, what you need to know about IDA is that IDA is a federal law, as Jamie mentioned, and this particular law, although it does not provide FAPE for our private school students, it does provide an opportunity for students to at least receive services, although limited, at the school site in which they're attending, which is very important. But unfortunately, in Massachusetts, when we first began our journey to try to address this issue, once we got beyond the state matter, the state, we found very quickly, really was misinterpreting how IDA was to be implemented. They thought because in Massachusetts, we had FAPE in our state law, which actually was in some ways, in theory and on paper, a much more of an entitlement for our students. They did not have to worry about, if you will, the requirements of IDEA. I want to make it very clear, the individuals that were involved at this time are no longer at the Mass Department of Education. The person who was the special ed director at that time has long retired. And so I want to make a distinction here between personnel and who's involved. But as we began this journey, it was very clear that they were really misinterpreting their responsibility as related to IDEA. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to invite my colleague and good friend, Nancy, to join me in this discussion. And I will just say that In 2007, we began these initial conversations, but in 2015, Nancy and I began to work together along with some other amazing people. And I think then is when we really had some success as we kind of walked through this journey. And I'm just going to pause for a moment and let Nancy talk a little bit about the coalition that was formed, and from her perspective, her thoughts around that, the impact of that coalition.
Thanks, Steve. I have to say, I'm looking at this timeline and I cannot believe how long it took us to actually really get some traction. And I think your explanation of the interplay in Massachusetts between the state law and IDEA and the lack of understanding on many fronts of how these different regulations and federal and state requirements really were hindering our students, there was just so much education that needed to happen. I will say from my perspective at the time in 2015, I was working with the Jewish day schools in Greater Boston. We have a much smaller population of students as compared to the Catholic schools across the state. But we had very, very similar needs and interests. And we came to realize that together, we could really have a very strong voice. So we were incredibly grateful back in 2015 to make that connection with Steve and with the Catholic school, our Catholic school counterparts. And really, Steve, I would imagine you would agree, our approach was to be both respectful and yet hold the line and strong at the same time. We felt at times, even in our coalition work, that we were the David against the Goliath. And we really wanted to tame the Goliath, so to speak. At least that was sort of my thinking very often early on, was to try to show, and you can go to the next slide actually, to try to show to the folks at the Department of Education that at the end of the day, we were talking about students in Massachusetts, and that we wanted to get away from some of the political overtones or some of the frustration around budgets, and just sort of ask the question, don't we all care about students in Massachusetts, regardless of where they go to school, that they have their needs met? And you can see the timeline continues. The highlights, I think, Steve, were when we had some of those initial meetings back in 2015, when we uncovered this lack of understanding of IDEA, when we pushed the folks at the department to really look into the data. What we found was that they were not collecting data on our students, and that the numbers that we had were very far off from the numbers that they were collecting. Steve, do you want to say a little bit about that data, and then we can move on?
Yeah, the data was reflecting less than 1% of our students in private schools in Massachusetts were identified as having a need for special ed and a related service. And that number is just completely ridiculous when you think about the average in the state is around 16%. And we know in our schools that it can range anywhere from 8 to 16%, depending upon the school. And so they were really highly undercounted. And that made a big difference, in terms of the proportionate share, which will be explained a little later in the presentation. And the other thing I just want to note here, as you look at this timeline, what we found fascinating is as we worked with the department, as Nancy said, we really attempted to come to some sort of agreement with them in an amicable way. And ultimately, since we could not do that at that time, we decided, as you can see on this timeline, is that we had filed a claim. And what's interesting about the claim is that the way the process works is that initially you actually have to file with the state. And so we had to file a claim, and we did so on 27 LEAs, which are public school districts. In addition to that, we also felt it was important to file against the state. And we did that because in some ways we felt the districts were victims, because as I mentioned earlier, the state was misinterpreting the responsibility of the LEAs as it related to IDEA. and the guidance was not being provided to the LEAs in terms of how the law had to be implemented. And what we found fascinating, and we didn't know what to expect when we filed the claim with the state actually found itself out of compliance along with all the districts that we had filed on. And that was a very important step. However, what the state was requiring as a remedy, we did not feel was going to have a sustainable impact. And basically what they were requiring at the time was that there be some training. And we didn't believe that was going to be enough to really address the systemic issue that exists and the culture that had developed as a result of the practice over many, many years. And so we decided, as you can see in 2017, to appeal to the secretary at that time, and that's how the process works. And I'll pause here a moment and let Nancy speak a little bit about the decision.
Yeah, so Steve, thanks for bringing up the LEA versus the state issue. I think it's really important to point that out, that very often the folks at the LEA level, as much as the state didn't understand IDEA, the folks at the LEA level really didn't understand IDEA. And so we did feel uncomfortable actually having to go through the process and started to feel like they were being thrown under the bus by the state. And so we did make every effort in our complaint to point out that it really was the disconnect between the state and the LEAs, and the state not giving the LEAs the right guidance. And I really think, I would imagine, and I think we'll probably hear about this later on, that similar issues are found in other states where it's the local that ends up being blamed, but very often the local really doesn't understand how the federal IDEA is supposed to work. So we waited a very long time to hear back from our appeal. We kept checking. The appeal was October 2017. Finally, in August 2019, we got a decision. And frankly, we were pretty thrilled by the decision. It found, I think, for our appeal in every single count. It also, the decision noted that there should be some back support from the state because of a pattern and practice of our kids being left out for 10 years. And so the state was, not recommended, but required to go back, I believe it was 2 years, Steve?
Right.
And to recalculate proportionate share in order to ensure that there would be some redress for students who were left out of the process up until that point. It wasn't exactly the total that we were looking for. We really felt that it should go back to the beginning, the inception of IDEA, but there were a number of different ways that the state, at the federal level on the appeal, that they felt that they could only go back, I believe, 2 years. But we were pleased because not only did it show that every single count that we had, we were in the right, it really did send the message to the state that business as usual is not going to work. And it is time for us to rethink what we're doing here in order to make sure that our students are getting what they need.
Yeah. And
Steve, anything else before we move on?
Yeah, I would just add that, so just to give the audience a perspective, the settlement ended up being about $3.8 million. As Nancy said, we expected a lot more, but we, were at least pleased. It's not only about the monetary settlement, as Nancy was suggesting, it's also about changing the paradigm, because as Nancy also mentioned earlier, it's all about the kids. And our goal here really was not so much to gain additional funding. It really was to ensure that we could address the systemic issues that existed so that the culture could shift, and to ensure that our students in the future would have access to services. And that's really what we cared about. And we believe we had an obligation to be the voice for those students. And I think what this whole process outcome is not so much the 3.8 million, but we believe we've begun to change at least the paradigm and the culture in Massachusetts as it relates to private school students in special ed. Next slide, please. And just to share with you, we were, the Boston Globe had covered a front page story on this. And I think the important thing about this, which was interesting to me, is that the Boston Globe, because of being a national paper, we actually heard from some of our colleagues across the country that some of the larger LEAs had reached out to them asking about this and began to sort of think about what their processes were within their own departments, which we were delighted to hear, because certainly if we can have impact beyond Massachusetts, that was one of our, of course, aspirations. Nancy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, the ripple effect of this decision, I think, continues to have impact beyond where we were. The other thing I wanted to share, and you know, we can go on to the next slide, just some thoughts about this process. You know, the paradigm shift is not only on the state side, it's also among our private school families who really don't understand how this works or how the federal law fits into their experience. And actually, this slide isn't directly related to what I'm saying, but I'll just note that at least on the Jewish day school side, a lot of the work in the last decade has been engaging our families to understand that they actually do have a right to getting an IEP, even if their student isn't enrolled in the public school. And that proportionate share, which I know we'll speak about in a little bit under federal IDEA, can have direct positive impact for them. So they have to become more knowledgeable about the opportunities that are available to get support. What this slide is pointing to is just one of the things that we also realized is that at the state level and at the LEA level, there is a lot of misunderstanding about people who are choosing non-public education. They believe that if your child has a need, then they should just come to the public school. Why? They should just choose public. You know, why are you doing, and the messaging to parents often is, you are doing your child a disservice if you're keeping them in private school and they have a special ed need. But for many of our families, it doesn't feel like a choice. They really do feel that it is imperative that their child is part of their faith-based community and in the school, in the non-public school. The other fallacy is that private schools are all wealthy and they can afford to pay for whatever special ed needs their students have. That's just not true. And so these are all of the facts on the ground that I think we were able to talk about, to uncover. And on our end, Steve, I know you did this as well, we started meeting LEA by LEA and having sort of face-to-face conversations with the key people at each of the school districts to start to talk about some of these issues and try to clarify the facts. And it was a really eye-opening experience during those years. I think there are a few more conclusions on the next slide, and I know we're running a little over. So yeah, this, you know, just we realize we can't assume that everybody understands how this works, both on the private school side and on the public school side. We need more understanding of how the laws interplay, of what the federal law offers, what the state mandate is. And frankly, in Massachusetts, it's probably the most complex because of the Blaine Amendment, the Anti-Aid Amendment that you heard about earlier, and how the state law works here. Our sense is that in other states, it might be a little bit simpler. Steve, do you have anything to add on this one?
I'm good. I'm good, Nancy.
Yeah. And then I think we, is this the next slide already that we're on? Yeah. Yeah, this is it. Just at the end of the day, the key in all of our conversations was to remind people, whether it be at the state level or at the LEA level, that it was the students that we were concerned about and that their needs were not being met. And we had to assume that we all shared the same goal of, regardless of where a child is going to school, they should be getting what they need in order to thrive. And that, I think, we kept coming back to those sorts of conversations. And I think that really helped us move. And as I said earlier, it was a long timeline, but it did help us get traction and help us move ahead. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Tom for his remarks. And That's it on our end.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Steve, for that explanation of the Massachusetts decision. One thing that both of you mentioned was the fact that in part, or perhaps in large part, the reason the IDA law was not working in Massachusetts was because of the lack of guidance coming from the State Department of Education filtered down to the local public school districts or the LEAs. And so that's kind of where I want to start and end, quite frankly, is to give a very brief overview. And the operative word here is very brief, because we could literally spend an hour or two or more talking about the intricacies of the IDEA law as it pertains to non-public school kids. But I just want to present to you sort of an overview. And as I like to call these components of IDEA, for private school students and families and teachers, the IDA law really rests on three pillars. Those three pillars are: number one, child find; second, consultation; and third, proportionate share. And if you think about these pillars in a Romanesque structure, and if you think about the roof upon that structure, if one of those pillars starts to shake or crumble or crack or fall down, then the whole structure goes with it. And so the problem that we have encountered with IDA, not only in Massachusetts, but indeed throughout this great country of ours, is the fact that these pillars are at best wobbly, and in many cases, they're cracking and falling down. And that is exactly the reason that IDA has not been working as it should for private school kids. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about first pillar one. And I'm naming the pillar one, not because child find is any more important than the other two pillars, but because it's the reasonable starting point from which we can discuss the three pillars as a whole. What child find is, as the name implies, it is the process by which the local public school districts are required to find the children who are attending the private schools within those self-same districts, who are to be identified and who will be identified as needing special education services. And so that is the responsibility. The child find process is the responsibility of the public school district. And the responsibility devolves to the public school district in which the private school is located. So for example, any private school in Boston, it is the Boston Public School District that is responsible for initiating and carrying out child find. And in addition to that, there's the whole process for which Boston would be responsible. For example, child find and the laws pertaining thereto are very clear that the LEA or the public school district have to be proactive in terms of informing private school parents of the availability of child find. What do I mean by proactive? Proactive can't mean in 2021 simply sending out 2 or 3 days before some sort of arbitrary deadline that child find's available. No, the LEA is responsible to be proactive in terms of reaching out to private school folks through social media, perhaps through websites, other very proactive means of making sure that the private school constituency is aware of child find. After these parents are made aware of it, and after these parents authorize their children to be found, as it were, if they suspect their child to have a disability, at that point, the public school district is also responsible for conducting the child find assessments. These assessments, by the way, can be carried out on site at the private school. They need not be carried out at the public school site. And these assessments, or evaluations as the law calls them, are meant for ages 3 through 21, ages 3 through 21. And so it is the primary obligation of the LEA to inform of the child find process and then to conduct the child find process. Next slide, please. Some additional elements to child find is that an LEA may not require response to intervention as a condition for conducting child find. So in other words, RTI, as many of the educators here would know, is a very good educational practice, but it is by no means required for child find to be engaged in. And as I mentioned, and I think it's worth repeating, the LEA where the private school is located is responsible for the carrying out of child find. And by the way, this applies to students who reside out of state. So let's just say in Southern Massachusetts, there were a student attending private school in Massachusetts, but they're living in Rhode Island. Well, that school is still responsible for finding that child, for identifying that child, etc. And the LEA must also conduct the child find process within the timeline that is set by the state or within 60 days, which is the federal time limit. Now, let me just break down child find into roughly the 4 components sequentially. The first part of child find would be the referral. Of course, that would come from the parents themselves referring their child to child find. The second part is the evaluation, the actual testing. The third part of child find is the identification of private schools kids with learning differences. And then the fourth part of child find and the hopeful result of it would be the service of those self-same kids. Now, I'm going to get into this in a moment. The identified number of kids, irrespective of whether they actually receive service, is the factor that drives proportionate share, which I will discuss next. So we'll remember that when I get to proportionate share. It's the number of kids identified after the testing who were found to have special needs and or need related services that drives the proportionate share number. And as I'll say, the only thing the proportionate share is the proportionate share of IDA funding that should be apportioned to the service of private school kids. Next slide, please. A couple other points about child find. It's not a once and for all procedure. So any identification stands for 3 years. Now, it could be the case that a child exhibits additional disabilities, perhaps. And so just because a year ago a child was found to not have a disability does not mean that that child cannot be referred this year to be discovered in their disability. But again, the point is the identification of those disabilities is good for 3 years for the purposes of the generation of proportionate share. And then lastly, parents have a right to request a second opinion if they don't agree with the outcome of child find. But it's important to note here, sort of parenthetically, that not all states will accept private evaluations. So if a parent gets kind of irritated with the LEA and says, well, I'm going to go find my own evaluator, the state need not necessarily accept that, but parents can and should request a second opinion if they're not happy with the child find outcome. Next slide, please. And the who pays for child find? Well, clearly that's the state. So the state, in this case the LEA, cannot charge off the costs of the testing, for example, to the proportionate share that is supposed to exclusively go to the service of the private school children. Next slide, please. So again, 3 pillars. Child find I just discussed. The second pillar, consultation. Next slide, please. Consultation. When we look at what that word definitionally means, it is inherently a word that refers to dialogue. Dialogue, which is to say, in any good conversation, it should be the fact that the private school representatives, perhaps accompanied by the parents, and the public school officials are literally sitting across the table from each other and discussing who of their children in the private school will be served, how those children will be served, what the proportionate share is, where the services can occur. By the way, services can occur on site at the private school as demonstrated by the Massachusetts decision. All of these very practical questions are supposed to be asked and then answered during consultation. So that means if a particular LEA makes a unilateral offer to a private school official or officials and says, well, this year we're only going to cover speech, that is a violation of the law. And unfortunately, throughout the country, we're seeing unilateral offers all the time, which suggests that consultation is not happening. Furthermore, what that suggests is that private school folks are not even aware of what their proportionate share is. So how can they possibly plan for the services that their students need if they're not even aware of how much federal dollars they have with which to work? Next slide, please. The consultation, by the way, must occur during the design and development of the special education and related services for recipients. So it can't be post de facto. It can't be a public school system saying to a private school, you know, we've already kind of gotten together and decided, and this is what we're going to do this year. No, no, no. That has to occur. The consultation, that is, has to occur during the design and development phase or stage of the consultation process. Next slide, please. So we're now on our third and final pillar. Child find was first, consultation was second, and now here we are at proportionate share. And as I mentioned now in the past, I'll repeat, proportionate share, as the title implies, simply refers to the amount of monies, federal funds, that can be utilized to provide services to parentally placed private school kids. Very important for me to note, by the way, proportionate share does not mean that a private school ever gets a check. A private school will never be given money. What a proportionate share refers to is the amount of money that a private school can utilize to pay for the services themselves having been identified during the consultation that should have occurred before services themselves are actually executed. Next slide, please. As was previously mentioned, FAPE, free and appropriate public education, is not granted to private school kids. So what ends up happening in this case with IDA is that private school kids, for lack of a better way of putting it, are granted a group entitlement. So that what that means is that it may be the case that in some private schools, not all children or disabilities will be served. But that's why consultation becomes so important, because it's at consultation, the dialogue whereby and wherein private school officials and LEA officials can come together in agreement as to which students within the private schools can be served. So it is, but again, as I repeated earlier, I'll repeat now, it is the number of kids identified, not the number of kids served ultimately, who are on which rather the proportion share amount is based. Next slide, please. And so the formula for proportionate share is relatively straightforward. You can see it on your screen there. And you can read that for yourself, but basically the proportionate share is based on the total universe of public, private, homeschool kids who are identified, and that's in relation to the number of private school kids who are similarly identified. Next slide, please. And we have here a little bit of an example that hopefully will flesh this out a little bit. I'll give you, 10 or so seconds to kind of look at that and to see that the proportionate share calculation itself is A, pretty easy to come by, and B, should be a component of the conversation that is had during consultation with the LEA. So I'll give you 5 seconds just to look at this. And one thing to note, $1,700 there, you see that average allocation per eligible child. The national average of the per pupil allocation for IDA is $1,730. So if a private school or private school system is being told by their LEA, that the proportionate share per child is only $400 or $600 or $800, well, not all is right in Dodge, as they say. And so that should also be looked at. That's not to say that across the board, the per pupil allocation is $1,700. In some places, of course, it's going to be a little less. And in some cases, it'll be a little bit more. But again, to remark, 1,700, to be precise, 1,730 is the national average. And then you do the math and you come up with in this case, this example, $34,000 for the service of those kids in that private school or private schools within that LEA who are eligible for that amount of services based on that funding. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the cracking, crumbling, falling down of the 3 pillars, this is going on across the nation in all 50 states. And I kid you not. And Massachusetts was just the beginning, as Steve and Nancy have remarked, but this is a systemic issue. And that is in part what our paper tried to get at by looking deeply at some other states throughout the union where there are similar problems. Next slide, please. And I'd like to, look at one example. Can anybody guess what state this is? No, don't worry about it. I'm not going to make you guess because how would you know, right? I had to take notes on this myself. This actually is the state of Florida. This is data out of the state of Florida. And what you'll see here on the screen is I looked at 2018, 2019 school year. You see in the top right-hand column there, 3.6 million kids total enrolled in the state of Florida. Under that number, you have the public school enrollment of 3.2 million, and then under that number is the private school enrollment, so 380,000. If you look at the next block down, you look at the first number for the public school system. There were 343,000 kids being referred that year. Evaluated was 327,000, identified was 323,000. The total IDEA allocation for the state of Florida that year was over 693 million. And roughly 10% of the kids, the public school kids in Florida got served, 10%. And by the way, parenthetically speaking, that figure's a little low. Nationally, the average is more like 14 to 15% in some cases, but Florida offers us a nice round number of 10%. But what I want to focus on for a very brief moment is the percentages as they compare for the private schools. Let's just cut right to the chase. Right below, if you see below in that bottom column, only 1,374 kids were served that year in Florida. That is less than half of 1%. And folks, that's not believable at all. It is not the case that less than half of 1% of the kids attending Florida's private schools should have been identified and ultimately served via IDA. If you look at the left-hand side, I kind of did a comparison. I looked at the actual numbers of kids served and identified, and then I looked at the rightful numbers of private school kids identified. And what I did to come up with that rightful number is I simply multiplied the first number by 7 to 14%. So at a minimum, with 7% of the private school kids in Florida having been identified, the rightful number should have been 26,000, over 26,000. And why that's important in terms of identification, as I mentioned, is because that drives proportionate share. So if you see the actual proportionate share granted to private school kids in the state of Florida in school year 2018-2019 was less than $3 million. It should have been closer to anywhere between 52 and 97 million dollars. Now I want you to think about that for a moment. Think about the fact that that much money was left on the table, that much money in services was effectively denied our kids, and think of how much good that money and those services could do for private schools, but more importantly for the kids, by which those services could be served. And I also want to make one last comment before I move on to our next presenter. The thing to keep in mind, and we run into this all the time, is that IDA funds do not belong to any given LEA. Oftentimes there's a mentality out there that the private schools are taking money away from the poor public schools. That is not the way to look at this. These are federal funds, and they are given to the public school system to basically be custodians of. This is not their money. This is not their money at all. And so it's important for them to realize that this is federal funds contributed to by federal taxpayers, which include public school parents, homeschool parents, and private school parents alike. And so I will leave there with that, just something to think about. It goes back to our first presentations in terms of the role of the federal government and states and all that good stuff. But just think of that as you think about this issue at a greater depth. And at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Kate McConnell from the Archdiocese of Chicago to join us.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for this important webinar. And thank you, Pioneer Institute, for hosting. As was mentioned, my name is Kate McConnell, and I currently serve as the Director of Inclusive Education for the Office of Catholic Schools at the Archdiocese of Chicago. However, it's important to note that the schools under the umbrella of the Archdiocese of Chicago are located in not just the LEA of Chicago Public Schools, but approximately 60 LEAs. My job is to maximize the ability of our schools to set all students up for success, as well as to educate our school leaders on how to leverage IDEA to support our students with disabilities. In this role, I often work as a mediator between the LEA and our schools located in those LEAs. In addition, I often work with schools and families when students are going through the referral process. As noted in the introduction, I spent about 10 years at a Catholic school as the director of inclusive education, where at least once a month, I was advocating for families of children suspected of having a disability at the eligibility table at CPS. Finally, I also volunteer as a special education advocate for families of students suspected of having a disability who need support in getting services. This has brought me to the eligibility table of LEAs, the offices of private school administrators, and the customer support centers of the publishing companies of standardized tests to advocate for students attending both public and private schools in various states, including Maryland, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Florida, and of course, Illinois. What I've learned is what my allies in IDEA have already shared with you. The pillars are in need of support. So let's start with pillar 1, child find. So if we could go to the child find slide. As Steve, Nancy, and Tom have shared, thank you, Pioneer. As Steve, Nancy, and Tom have shared, the numbers are off. They are flawed. Most egregious is, as Tom just shared, they are exceptionally low. I believe the main reason why the numbers are low is because we're seeing an overcorrection of over-identifying students with disabilities. So let me explain. About 20 years ago, LEAs across the country were called on the carpet for over-identifying students as needing special ed. This was a legitimate and concerning problem. Prior to the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004, students who were identified as needing special education were often spirited away in a self-contained classroom where they stayed all day, eating lunch, hid from assemblies, and kept out of sight. That was a problem. Being identified as needing special education was practically a prescription for dropping out of school early, or a path to drug abuse. It was very difficult for students in those classrooms to prove their worth or engage in learning that excited them. I remember my first year teaching special education at a Chicago public school about 20 years ago in a cross-categorical classroom. My students were not invited to attend the school assemblies so that they would not disrupt them. That seemed really unfair to me, so I snuck my students into an assembly that was designed to celebrate Black History Month. Now, mind you, 95% of my students were Black in a school where only 10% of the population was Black. And this was an assembly to celebrate Black History Month, and my kids were not invited. It was nonsense. Well, I was called on the carpet by my first principal for being insubordinate because my students were not supposed to attend the assembly, and he had made that very clear to me. However, I am more stubborn than I am a good employee and continued to sneak my students into assemblies until my principal gave up. And I'm proud to say that one of my last assemblies at that elementary school was when Arnie Duncan, who is the CEO of CPS at the time, visited. And my students and I sat in the front row, and we actually got caught on the stage for being so engaged. And as a side note, I turned bright red when my student Ronald told Mr. Duncan he was the tallest teacher he had ever met, and Mrs. McConnell was the shortest one he had ever met. And there's a picture somewhere out there to prove that that moment happened. But hopefully this illustrates that there was a problem and the school system did need to be called on the carpet for over-identifying students with special needs, especially Black boys. In Chicago, at least, the carpet they were called on was an actual lawsuit known in the teacher's lounge as the Corey H. decision. This required that CPS schools prove to the state that they were being careful and intentional with identifying students with special needs and placing those students in the least restrictive environment, what is known as LRE. So now CPS and other LEAs are required to demonstrate not only LRE, but that the number of students being identified as needing special ed is decreasing, which makes no sense. In the past 20 years, we've gotten better at educating students with disabilities. The self-contained classrooms are few and far between, as they should be. And the research shows students, both those with disabilities and without disabilities, perform best in the least restrictive environment where general education and special education students are educated together. In addition, we've gotten better as educators at noting when a student needs help, as opposed to the bygone years of the 60s and 70s of kicking out students with disabilities. To keep those numbers low, what I'm seeing at the eligibility table is that families and schools are being told that their children aren't eligible for special education services, so they don't qualify for what would be an IEP in the public school or a services plan in the private school, but they do qualify with a 504, which falls under the umbrella of the Office of Civil Rights, not the Department of Education. This is a problem because that number does not get reported to the SEA as part of the child find count, which shortchanges all students with disabilities, those in public and private schools. And it also does not bring services and supports to students with disabilities, or it's not supposed to anyway, although we are seeing some LEAs writing social work services for students on 504s. In addition to families being pacified with 504s, private schools are being told they haven't provided enough evidence of RTI, response to intervention, to warrant an evaluation. Now, many of my colleagues in the private school world will quote, as Tom did earlier, that the part of IDEA that says private schools don't need to provide RTI. However, having come from the public school side and being part of the eligibility team and seeing firsthand the over-identification of students with disabilities, I do think it's important that we make sure as private school representatives that we share responsible referrals. The goal here is to level the playing field for children with disabilities. However, many LEAs, no matter what we give them as private schools, push back and say, it's not enough RTI or not enough evidence, even if the evidence we provide includes a private neuropsychological evaluation and 3 months of data. In addition, we've noticed LEAs interpreting the least restrictive environment as the general education classroom for all students all the time. But that's just as wrong as saying that once a student is found eligible for special ed services, that student goes to a self-contained classroom forever. The goal should always be to return the student to the general education classroom with the least amount of supports. But to get there does require intensive supports from time to time. For instance, I had to go to an optometrist to get prescribed glasses. Being surrounded by peers with 20/20 vision is not enough to help me see clearly. Next slide, please. The second pillar that is crumbling up close and personal is consultation. It really is not happening as intended by the law. At the NCEA conference this week, which is the National Catholic Education Association conference, Pamela Allen, the program specialist for the Office of Non-Public Education for the U.S. Department of Education, reiterated that the intent of timely and meaningful consultation meetings should be happening throughout the school year. Yet, in the guidance to LEAs in Illinois from the Illinois State Board of Education, it states that the TMC meeting should happen by May 31 of each year, implying it happens once a year. That's not timely, it's not meaningful, and it's not consultative. But it is what the LEAs are being told what is appropriate by the SEA. Further, it's written in the law that the LEA, in the federal law, that the LEA makes the final decision. This has resulted in many people in both the private and public sectors interpreting this to mean that whatever the LEA gives is a gift, and we should just say thank you, walk away, and see you next year. That's not the intent of the law either. In addition, because the LEA makes the final decision, biases do cloud the process. I've had people in LEAs say to me things like, I don't think it's fair that private school kids get services, such as Nancy referenced earlier, noting that their parents are wealthy or the schools are wealthy. And there should be a separation of church and state. So the public dollars should not be going to the students at all. And we don't have to give you anything. Next slide, please. Finally, because the numbers are wrong, the funding is completely off. In addition, as my colleagues have reported, the LEAs are not reporting accurately to the state. And sometimes that's because the LEA simply does not understand the requirements. And that's a problem. Let's remember the LEA is actually often one person who might be new to the job. At the Archdiocese, we have made some great strides with LEAs who are open to the idea that they may need assistance in understanding this little piece of legislation. For example, we have one LEA who for the last 5 years has reported 0 private school students to the state who are eligible for services, even though that LEA did the eligibilities and wrote service plans. The person in charge sincerely believed it was the private school's responsibility to report the numbers to the SEA. With all that said, I actually love IDEA. I think it's a great piece of legislation because of its lofty goal of giving a helping hand to children with disabilities. It definitely needs help and needs to be reauthorized soon. This is a great legislation, I think, that speaks to the hearts and minds of conservatives and liberals alike. And next slide, please. And I like to advocate for our students in sound bites. And these are just a few of my quotes that I've used and shared with not just LEAs when talking about services that we'd like to see at our private schools, but also talking with people at the eligibility table. Just like dreamers who are brought to the US without papers, students don't choose to have disabilities. And typically they're not choosing where they enroll in schools. That's families. When I've heard that there should be a separation of church and state, I often share that families who are deeply religious send their children to public schools, and non-public school students with disabilities use public parks, public libraries, and public transportation. And families of non-public school students pay taxes. And when it comes right down to it, we're talking about children with disabilities. And I think when we really think about it, we all want to help children with disabilities. So I think this is an easy legislation that we can all get behind to get reauthorized and strengthen those pillars. And we are completely out of time, so I'm going to throw it back to Jamie, who's going to wrap it up for us.
Great. So I want to thank all of the authors and the panelists for their tremendous work on this topic. It really goes back, in truth, decades. I think you can see it's enormously important. When the founding fathers established the state and federal constitutions, they did so to perpetuate what George Washington called the sacred fire of liberty. But also, they wanted to make sure that public officials are accountable at every level. And you can see in its own way how IDEA has some work to do to uphold that high ideal. Again, we're grateful for your time and appreciate your interest in this topic. If you want to know more about it, look at our website, pioneerinstitute.org. Thank you.